Welcome back. This video has a very high reliance on a previous video, the video of the female anatomy of the reproductive system. And if you didn't get a chance yet to watch that video, scroll to the end of this one. I'll provide a link to that one and you can have a look at that first and then come back and look at this one. As I say, to really understand the content in this video, you really have to understand that one first. As well, when you're at the end of the video, if you scroll forward, you'll find a circle with a green gecko in it. Don't forget to subscribe. That's my subscribe button. And when you subscribe, I know you'll enjoy watching my videos. The female reproductive system parallels the male reproductive system. And this diagram I've presented before in a number of ways with the neuroendocrine control system, the male reproductive system, and already again with the female reproductive system. This is the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary here, and the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is up here. And in a young girl's life, at some point, the brain recognizes that the systems are ready for sexual maturity, and the brain, which part of the brain is the hypothalamus, will trigger the release of certain hormones. These hormones are called releasing factors. So the hypothalamus will release GnRF, which affect the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, in response to that, releases two different hormones. These hormones, LH and FSH. Luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. Now, to bring it back to the other video, if this is an ovary, inside the ovary at a young girl's life, or during a young girl's life, there are, say, 1 million what we can call clone cells. They're all identical. These are the cells that will become ova. They can become ova. They've already started their meiotic division, but they've stopped at prophase 1. So they're all still genetically identical, so we can use the term clone cells, but they're distinct from the other cells in the tissue of the ovary because they've already started to undergo meiosis. Now, what happens here is follicle stimulating hormone affects the clone cells, and it causes several of these to begin to mature. Remember, the clone cells become surrounded by the follicle cells, so what we have in essence is a thing that looks like this, where this cell in the middle is the future ovum, or potentially future ovum, and these are follicle cells. And like I say, there's millions of these, or maybe 1 million of these in an ovary, and follicle stimulating hormone affects the follicles, which really look like this. They have the two components to them. The whole thing is just called a follicle, though. Several of them mature, but generally only one of them becomes a fully matured follicle, so it'll continue to develop. As I draw a line like that, and over time, they don't necessarily move in the ovary, but over time they get larger and larger and larger. Now, as I draw this thing, I'm sort of tempted to say, well, how big is an ovary? Like, well, how big is the thing we're talking about here? And this is probably the best representation I can give you to it. A human ovary is about the size of an individual chicken egg. So we're talking about that sort of structure. And millions of cells are in the ovary. Luteinizing hormone is another sort of hormone that it does the same sort of thing as in males. It affects the tissues of the ovary and causes the ovary to release two different hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen as we've already mentioned, is the one in the other video we mentioned, is the one that stimulates the secondary sex characteristics in females. And much like testosterone, there's a number in males, there's a number of things that happen in females. So estrogen, at sexual maturity, this starts to happen. Then estrogen causes the secondary sex characteristics in females. So we're talking about things like pubic hair, axillary hair, which is hair in the armpit area, change in fat distribution in the body, the growth of the primary sex characteristics, there's changes in the skeletal system, such as the widening of the hips, and I guess the other one that we have to mention is the breast development. And where estrogen does this, stimulates breast development as one of those things, progesterone also affects breast development. And progesterone actually contributes to the development of the breast, and in particular, the glandular tissues in the breast. So, where we can say that the female and male reproductive systems are homologous, right away we recognize that they have some significant differences. And let me just point some of that out. In the male system, we had luteinizing hormone, we had follicle stimulating hormone, that's true. Then we had testosterone. And testosterone levels were maintained fairly even, because testosterone levels, as it increased, it affects the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and decreases the secretion of luteinizing hormone, so you get less testosterone being produced. Here, that's not the case. In females, we've got these two hormones, but we also have two other hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And they have their own set of functions, but they also have changes that take place on a cyclical basis. So there's a very, very big difference here. In the female system, we have two cycles. We have a thing called the ovarian cycle, where there's a series of changes that goes on in the ovary. And progesterone also, I didn't write it down here, but progesterone also affects the uterus. We have a uterine cycle, and we'll get to that coming up here. Those two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, together are called the menstrual cycle. And that cycle, like any cycle, it repeats itself. It repeats itself, goes on and over and over again. And that repetition occurs on about every 28 days. So with a cycle, you have to understand that there's a beginning to it. Although it repeats itself, there has to be a consideration given to, okay, what's the beginning of the cycle? And the beginning of these cycles is when all four hormones are at their lowest levels. And the GnRFs begin to secrete this, which begins to have those things happening, right? So the beginning of the ovarian cycle, the beginning of the uterine cycle are when all four hormones are at the lowest point. Now, what I'd like to do is consider the ovarian cycle first, and then looking at what happens inside the ovary, and then we can get to the uterine cycle by extending the topic to these hormones here. So let me erase this and this. And here's a larger picture of the ovary. Now remember, the ovary is about the size of an egg, but let's go back to where we have these immature follicles, the clone cells, what happens under the influence of FSH from the anterior pituitary. Some of these, a few of these, begin to mature. Now they're all around the whole thing here, but I'll just represent them on one side. As they begin to develop, as I indicated a couple of minutes ago, we have a thing called a follicle, which is the future ovum surrounded by follicle cells. Those are the follicle cells, and they're surrounding the future ovum. So under the continued influence of FSH, this continues to grow and develop. There's our future ovum, follicle cells around it. The purpose of the follicle cells is very much the same as the Sertoli cells in the male. The follicle cells support this ovum. They help it through its cell division, the rest of its cell division, which we should mention something about here. What I said before is it stops at prophase 1. So these cells are arrested at prophase 1. They still have, they're still diploid, but the chromosomes are duplicated already, but they haven't started to divide yet. So what has to happen after prophase 1 is in meiosis, as we all know, there's two cell divisions that occur. And the end result of these two cell divisions, you get 4 daughter cells, all genetically distinct. So we start with a cell in prophase 1, and we wind up dividing and dividing and dividing. So you wind up with 4 cells. But here, in the case of the ovum, it's an unequal division. It's very important to realize that we wind up with chromosomes, genetic material in here, but all the cytoplasm and all the other stuff that is essential for the growth of an ovum, and should fertilization occur, a future embryo, all the cytoplasm and a lot of the organelles wind up in one of them. So we have an unequal division. And so you can see that the other one is going to be the same way. So we wind up with 1, 2, 3 cells out of the 4, which are nothing more than a membrane with chromosomes in them. They don't have any cytoplasm. All the cytoplasm winds up in one cell, in this particular daughter cell, the way I've drawn it anyway. So we have all the cytoplasm in here, which is very important, like I say, for the growth of the embryo should fertilization occur. So we wind up with an ovum, which is actually a fairly large cell. You know, if it's got all the cytoplasm, it's like 4 times the size of a regular cell. So these things, like I say, that as that cell division continues over a time period here, so if we talk about time progressing, this cell becomes larger and larger and larger, and maybe a few actually mature to the point where they wind up on the surface. So we have a mature follicle like that, and this mature follicle is called a Graafian follicle. Now, during ovulation, we'll get into the mechanics of ovulation in a little bit here. During ovulation, what happens is the ovum gets released from the Graafian follicle. So we have the ovum itself here. And the tissues around it, the follicle cells, actually change. I'm going to continue the timeline here. The tissue around it, the follicle cells, become an active piece of tissue in here. It's called a corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum remains as an active tissue secreting hormones which affect the uterus. We haven't said anything about the uterine cycle yet, but it remains active for about 10 more days, during which time these hormones are secreted. But after about 10 days, if it isn't supported by another hormone, which we'll have to get to later on, it will degenerate and it becomes known as a corpus albicans. Just to bring a little bit of light to these terms, luteum means yellow and albicans means white. So as long as it's able to produce and secrete the hormones, it's yellowy in color and then it becomes white. Our timeline here, if we say this was one day, day one in the cycle, this happens on what we say on the average is something like about day 14. This lasts about 10 days, so that gets us up to 28 days, and there's a couple of days in here where we're back to day one. So there's our cycle of 28 days. So this is called the uterine cycle, or the ovarian cycle, sorry, ovarian cycle. Now the ovarian cycle, if we look at the events that happen in here, there are three parts to it. This business here, where it goes from day 1 to day 14, is called the follicular phase. During the follicular phase, the follicle is developing from the initial clone cell to a Graafian follicle. Day 14, roughly, of course, we have ovulation, which is simply the release of the ovum, and after that we have from day 14 to say day 25, 20, well really it goes to the beginning of the cycle, but the corpus luteum degenerates into an albicans after about day 25, 26. This is called the luteal phase. And then, of course, once we're back to here, we have higher levels of this FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, starts to be secreted again, and we have that cycle. It begins to repeat itself every 28 days. So that's the ovarian cycle. What I'd like to do now is go on, we'll look at the uterine cycle, and then I would like to take the two cycles and put them together. So if that's ovarian, the uterine cycle, we don't need this. And this uterine cycle. And remember, the uterus is it's a fairly large structure. It's larger than the ovary, and it's bilaterally symmetrical. The oviduct, or fallopian tubes as they're called, end at a series of finger-like structures which are called fimbriae, and it's on this side as well. See if I can get this somewhat symmetrical. So let's just do a little bit of labeling here. Oviducts or fallopian tubes, it's the same thing, fimbriae. The ovary might be located about there. This is the uterus. Vagina, cervix. So far I've drawn this whole thing as a hollow structure, and as much as it is a hollow structure, it does have some thickness to the walls of it. The cervix is a muscular constriction, and the uterus is a muscular organ that changes in the uterine cycle. So let's say this tube goes up to the fimbriae. So ovarian cycle. At the beginning of the cycle, remember, all four hormones or levels are low. So we have low LH, low FSH, we have low estrogen, we have low progesterone. What happens in the cycle as we go from day 0 to day, say, about 5, at that period of time, or during that period of time, the tissues inside the uterus are being shed. So this tissue in here has all become engorged, rich with blood supply. That tissue is the endometrium. It becomes rich with blood supply in the event that fertilization has occurred and implantation has to take place for a baby to develop. So the ovum would travel down the oviduct, and if it's fertilized, it could embed in this tissue. Should it embed in the tissue, the endometrium obviously isn't shed. It'll stop the shedding that has to be maintained for a baby to develop. If there is no fertilization, if there is no implantation, then the endometrium becomes sort of a useless sort of tissue. It's not required anymore, so it's shed. So that's the first period of time when the hormone levels are low, there's nothing maintaining that endometrium. So it gets shed. So this is from day 0 to 5, menstruation. Following that, after the endometrium is shed, now let me just very quickly just erase that, take it back to day 6 where there is no buildup of tissue in here. Following that, of course, it's a cycle, that tissue has to begin to build up. So what happens is the hormones, progesterone primarily, progesterone begins to proliferate this inner lining here. So the endometrium starts out quite thin, and it continues to develop. So we're going to say from day 6 to day 14, we have what we call the proliferative phase. And this is when the endometrium builds up. So we're talking about builds up its blood supply. And it goes on, like I say, for almost 2 weeks, or for the better part of 2 weeks anyway, and becomes quite thick. In the eventual fact that the possibility that an ovum travels down here, gets fertilized, it has to have enough blood supply for implantation. Notice the timing here now. Both cycles, the ovarian and the uterine cycle, start at day 0 or day 1, and on day 14, at the end of the proliferative phase, then endometrium is built up. Also on day 14 is when the ovum is released. So the ovum could be released and fertilized. The endometrium is ready for it. Now, following that, in the other part, if fertilization doesn't occur, we still have a number of changes here that have to take place, because the female body doesn't know that fertilization is going to occur or not. So we have to consider that in the length of time it takes an ovum to travel along here, let's just go back and say that happens. Let's say the ovum is released from here, ovulation, day 14. The fimbriae, if you remember their function, the fimbriae are the finger-like structures which create a bit of a current in the fluid of the body cavity, and that ovum travels in to the oviduct, and down here it takes 4 or 5 days for that ovum to get down there. It's not exactly a motile structure. The oviducts, or the fallopian tubes, are ciliated, and it's the action of cilia that create the water movements or the fluid movements that drive it down to here. All during that time, of course, this is still getting ready for the possibility of implantation, and that could take place obviously not normally before day, say, say day 20 or something like that. And after that, the menstrual cycle will begin again. The changes that have to occur in here to continue this proliferation, to allow implantation to occur, is this tissue has to become what we call secretory. It has to be able to secrete a certain amount of mucus and fluid to allow implantation and to allow a placenta to begin to develop. So this next part in here, the last part, is called the secretory phase. And that, again, is when it begins to become secretory, and that's the mature uterine lining. If no fertilization occurs, say around day 25, when the corpus luteum is no longer producing its hormones, which actually maintain this, then this becomes a little bit more unstable and menstruation can follow. What I'd like to do now is take the uterine cycle, if you get the series of changes that happens there, and the ovarian cycle, and put them together so you could actually see the connections between them. So let me erase this and be right back. Now, to put these two cycles together, I want to present them in a graphical manner. So we have a graph here which has, I'm going to chop this up into a number of spaces, but our timeline is going to be on the bottom. So we're going to put time here, and we're going to put, say, day 1 here, day 14 in the middle, day 28 here, which really, if you think about it now, day 28 is the beginning of the next cycle, so this thing would just go from here and it would start to repeat itself there. So we have this repeating cycle 28 days long. What I'd like to do with this vertical axis is represent hormone levels and what goes on in the uterus and in the ovary. So let me take a look at it this way and say this is our, let's put it here, the ovarian cycle. I'll put it there. Now, at the beginning of the ovarian cycle, we have the ovary, which with all the clone cells, the immature ova, we can represent them the same way as they were before, and that continues to develop. This is the follicular phase, remember. And as a few of these develop, they become larger, and at the day 14, we have one in particular that may be large enough and mature enough that can be called a Graafian follicle, moved to the surface of the ovary. So that's our follicular phase. Day 14, we have ovulation, where an ovum is released. Following day 14, the corpus luteum lasts for about 10 days. Oops, I draw that a little bit awkwardly. And it becomes a corpus albicans after that. So here's our corpus luteum. And corpus albicans. So there's the ovarian cycle on that 28-day timeline. The uterine cycle, I'll put here. And I'm not going to draw the uterus a number of times, but I will represent the thickness of the endometrium. Because that's really what changes in the uterine cycle. It builds up, it becomes secretory, and it sheds. So we'll represent the uterine cycle as the thickness of the endometrium. So we'll just do it in a relative manner, but let's say at the beginning where the endometrium is at its thickest, it's ready for implantation, but it hasn't happened, so it's going to get shed. What happens is it becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. So that's 5 days over that period of time that happens. This is menstruation or menses. That's the first period of time there, and then it begins to proliferate again. So as it does, it begins to thicken, and this is our proliferative phase, and after it thickens, well, the same thickness there, it becomes secretory, and I'll represent this as the glandular nature of it. So it's thick, it becomes glandular, so it can have secretions as well, and that'll be maintained up to about day 28 when menses will begin again. So we have in here our proliferative phase, where it's becoming thicker in the secretory phase there. But the question is, really, what causes this? What is it that links all these things together? And the answer to that question is the hormones. The hormones tie it all together. We've said that at the beginning, all 4 hormone levels are low. So I'm going to put hormone levels in the middle here so we can link the whole thing vertically. LH and FSH are both low at the beginning. I'm going to put LH in first, and then I'll put FSH. We'll do estrogen and progesterone. So if this line begins LH, low level, as the ovarian cycle begins, luteinizing hormone begins to increase in level, and I'm going to be very careful how I do this. It doesn't increase very much, and I'll stop it there. FSH similarly, it starts out low, and it doesn't do very much either. But the thing that happens is LH does affect the follicles, and luteinizing hormone promotes the secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the follicle tissues inside the ovary. And what happens is, as estrogen, I'm just going to put an E for estrogen, as estrogen levels increase, it seems that the increasing level of estrogen is what keeps these levels down. And it's believed that there's a negative feedback relationship here where estrogen levels increase. As they increase, it affects the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and it diminishes that tissue's ability to secrete these hormones. And as long as that happens, these things, they seem to go up, but they seem to be held back a little bit. At some point, and it's somewhere in around day 14, as the estrogen level gets to a certain height, it can no longer impact the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And what happens is because it no longer can affect it, these levels shoot up. So our luteinizing hormone level and our follicle stimulating hormone level to a lesser extent, but it does shoot up as well, because estrogen can no longer have that negative feedback relationship. And this sudden surge in luteinizing hormone, and notice I put it right here on day 14, this is called the LH spike. The LH spike is believed to be what causes ovulation. So the hormone level goes whoop, way up. Remember, luteinizing hormone affects the ability of the tissues to be able to secrete their hormones, and this sudden surge here causes ovulation. And then the rest of that uterine or ovarian cycle can continue. We haven't said anything about progesterone yet. Let me just get another color here. I'm going to put a P for progesterone. Progesterone, again, the level of progesterone is low and it begins to increase. Progesterone is what, notice the shape of this and here. Progesterone is what's causing this proliferation here. So now, if you remember that it's the follicle cells in the ovary that are secreting these two hormones. This event here, this ovulation, affects the follicle's ability to secrete these two hormones. Not so much progesterone, because its level does go up and it gets, it sort of mimics the shape of the thickness of the endometrium, but estrogen, because of ovulation, estrogen levels go down and then they come back up. This estrogen level here is what causes the secretory phase. So this increase here causes it to become secretory. So it causes that maturity of the endometrium and the maturity of this glandular material. This progesterone level is what proliferates the thickness, so it allows the tissues to become thicker and engorged with blood. As long as progesterone and estrogen are there, this is what it looks like. However, they were initially secreted by the follicle. Now the follicle doesn't look like this anymore. What's left of the follicle is the corpus luteum. And we've already said that the corpus luteum degenerates after about 10 days, becomes a corpus luteum. The corpus albicans, the corpus luteum will secrete this hormone. And as long as the corpus luteum is active, it will continue to secrete the progesterone. After about 10 days, progesterone levels diminish because the corpus luteum begins to degenerate. So this level here decreases. And when that happens, of course, so does this level. And I'll finish all four of these lines here. The LH spike, this has served its purpose. It's come back down to a low level, and so has follicle stimulating hormone. It served its purpose. It stimulated the follicle so that the follicle matures and it comes back down to a low level. So here we have it. At day 28, all four hormone levels are low, same as they were at the beginning. So now the system is ready to begin all over again. So I think we have it. There is another topic that extends from this one. We've always said in here that in readiness for fertilization, in readiness for implantation, if that happens, and we've just said that it doesn't happen. We haven't talked about what happens should it happen. If it doesn't happen, this ovum travels through the uterus, down through the cervix, out the vagina. It's a large cell, but it's still microscopic. You're not going to find it ever. But if fertilization occurs, we have to consider the next part. Okay? So remember, click the gecko, subscribe to my videos, and stay tuned for the next part. Thank you.